We need to have a talk. At the end of the Hunt Showdown experience, when I mentioned that this video was on the way, in the same breath, I also said that I really enjoyed Helldivers 2, and that I believed Space Marine 2 would offer much of the same, which is why I wanted to open this one up with an apology. Because, bar the similarities they do have, and the fact that they're both horde-centric multiplayer juice fests, simply calling it a Helldivers 2 2 couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the Space Marine 2 experience offers us an impressive, singular example of how ideas of history, heroes, and legacy can come together to deliver a nostalgic and engaging yet future-proof video game that can elevate a long-lived and enduring IP far beyond its prior achievements. So with that said, my name is Toprak Tosin. I'm a professional user experience designer, and today on UX and Games, let's put some hair on your nuts.
My pledge is eternal service.
Warhammer is a name that underscores some of the deepest lore and history among all recorded intellectual property.
First started in 1987, it's as old as some cultural powerhouses like Star Wars and D&D.
And is well known as others like The Lord of the Rings, Marvel, or DC. And though it may not be comparable in terms of financial success to those IPs, the level of detail in this universe is bolstered by the countless writers, players, and filmmakers that over decades have built on the foundation established over 40 years ago to bring this universe to a level where it's arguably deeper than, or at least on par with, each of these IPs. Now, a big issue with something this dense is that capturing this history and remaining true to the source material while still giving newcomers a way to get familiar with it is not an easy task by any means. And there are countless examples owing to Games Workshop's comfort in licensing out their IP to creators that exemplify that fact. See Lost Crusade or Chaos and Conquest. So how did Saber Interactive do it so well? Once you start a new game for the first time, and I mean the first time, if you've played the prologue before, you cannot go back unless you cleared your story progress by starting from the beginning again, you're met with a bit of exposition and a cutscene, after which you find yourself on a planet in the middle of a Tyranid invasion, asking questions like, what is Project Aurora? Why is its strategic value absolute? Who is the Omnissiah? And most importantly, what the fuck is a machine god? Often, phraseology built around the lore of a fictional setting can give off an air of exclusivity and risks alienating us as an audience because it creates a separation from real-world concepts that we as humans tend to prefer. It makes them less relatable to us. Because we're unable to fit these new ideas into neat little boxes that we've built in our minds to keep our understanding of the world manageable, we feel like we don't belong here. For many, this is an incredibly potent repellent. But for some, the more quote-unquote devout among us, this is bait. When phrases like Primarch, Tyranid, or Omnissiah are thrown around that don't fit our existing mental categories, our brains have to build new ones, or schemas, from scratch. And therefore, we're forced to suspend our understanding until we can fully incorporate these new terms into our mental framework. In human psychology, this is called schema theory, and we reflexively do this because it allows us to process and interpret the incredible amounts of information we encounter daily, especially living in the information age. And this makes our cognition more efficient and adaptive. It's a tool we've intuitively developed to help us organize our knowledge and expectations about the world so we can recognize patterns, make predictions, and respond quickly to familiar situations. However, despite the fact that we've adapted to think this way in light of our current and constant exposure to information, it doesn't apply to everyone in the same way. Sometimes this suspension of understanding can make us feel stupid, and our response to it is mostly determined by psychological traits like an individual's cognitive style, need for cognition, openness to experience, and comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty.
Certain kinds of individuals, instead of seeing a barrier or an obstacle,
see a challenge. And to them, building complex connections within the confines of a given universe just makes the experience that much more rewarding because they are a bunch of nerds that never felt at home in the real world. I'm only kidding. It's because these individuals fit a specific kind of profile. And while these things are all essential for that initial spark to light the fire, you need to keep that flame fed so it doesn't burn out regardless of what kind of person you are. Those of you who've seen my Jusant video might recall that I mentioned this concept of user profiles and the role curiosity plays in them. So why didn't Space Marine 2 go the way of the Piper and the Whale after that initial exposure? Well, where Jusant failed to hook many players in the long term, relying almost exclusively on visuals and curiosity, Space Marine 2 succeeds spectacularly, because Saber Interactive made sure to consider and successfully apply frameworks that UX designers and game developers use to take psychological drivers like curiosity, challenge, exploration, autonomy, and our need for creativity into account when building their games. And they do it by constructing what are called player archetypes to work in tandem with these drivers. As an example, one of the most common of these frameworks is called Bartle's taxonomy of player types. This one in particular, created by Richard Bartle in 1996, categorizes players into 4 categories, namely achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers, depending on their motivation, behavior, and game design implications. While this might not have been the exact framework used in the development of Space Marine 2, frameworks like this one are simple yet incredibly versatile in how they can be used to give your players an identity before you can gather usage and demographic statistics, which makes them invaluable when determining how players might behave within your video game, and thus serve as a more practical, industry-centric application of the idea of profiles. Using this method, Saber Interactive have been able to cater to a huge spectrum of player archetypes. For example, the Achiever archetype is driven by progress, rewards, and the process of leveling up by collecting items and earning points. These tend to be your completionists, and consequently require things like progression systems to be built into your game. Contrast this with the Killer archetype, who tends to be driven by competition and the idea of winning against human opponents. Players that fall under this archetype often prefer to engage in activities that let them get recognition or victory over other players, and so may require ranking systems or leaderboards to be built into your game. But this can often be a double-edged sword because it lends itself to the homogenization problem that many developers have been facing recently, where the lines between these archetypes become so blurred that neither get the feelings or features that exemplify their individual roles. Once unique video game IPs have been having a bit of an identity crisis in recent years. I mentioned this in my Dead Space video in detail, so I don't want to retread covered ground, but in short, developers and publishers, in trying to cater to the full spectrum of player archetypes, risk losing their core identity. You don't have to look far to see examples of this. Look at Fortnite with its Marvel-themed brand crossovers, Call of Duty with its celebrity skins, and even the more recent Dragon Age Veilguard that's opted for a more tame and conflict-averse direction for an IP that would normally cover some pretty heavy subject matter, human extinction, a global apocalypse, and the like. So what did they do differently to retain the Warhammer identity despite successfully achieving the type of mass appeal that very few games achieve? Well, put simply, by tuning and refining this game around one key thing: onboarding. But not in the way that we typically understand it. Onboarding in UX is generally defined as the process of guiding new users through the initial stages of interacting with a product, service, or application. And in UX, the goal of onboarding is to make sure users understand how to use a product effectively and gain value from it quickly. In essence, if your game has an easy onboarding process and a shallow learning curve, it's more likely to retain filthy casuals because it often involves removing barriers to entry, making them easier to understand, and creating inclusive designs that cater to a wider demographic. This inclusivity is in a lot of ways fundamentally sound UX design as dictated by UX best practices. But designers, in the pursuit of best practices and accessibility, are in part responsible for watering down the depth that these other archetypes prefer. For example, we can see this in something like leaderboards. By taking the leaderboards and the rewards for topping them that the killer archetype would need, some games include more categories of leaderboard to allow the achiever archetype to feel like they're progressing in their own way, diluting the impact of a single point of comparison and all that comes with it: skins, weapons, and the like. It's a lot like how in basketball no one can decide on a GOAT, because Jordan had more rings than LeBron, but LeBron has amassed more accolades over a longer period of time. Saber have managed to break with, or at least bend, these restrictive standards, and instead of applying UX in the traditional, rigid, and narrow sense of simply getting people to adopt a platform or just play a game,
They've kept the core experience consistent while offering pathways for different player archetypes.
applied it in a more nuanced way that's more in line with the core identity of the world, to onboard their audience not just for this one product, but for the full Warhammer universe. See, the gap between the casual video game enjoyer and the hardcore gamer is still nothing when compared to the gap between the casual gamer and the Warhammer superfan. The question then, when you're dealing with the combination of the existing Warhammer audience and the gaming market masses, becomes no longer just, how do we keep both parties entertained, but instead, how do we turn one, the casual, into the other, a fan? How do we turn a heretic into a hero? To bridge this gap between identity, accessibility, and adoption, we need to do three things. Number one, start simple, build slowly. Number two, remain faithful to the universe. And number three, make sure your audience can connect with your characters. Space Marine 2 starts simple by introducing players to the Warhammer world primarily through its visceral combat, by centering the core experience around intense battles against hordes of Tyranids and the forces of chaos. The game allows you to get stuck into the IP's brutal expression of warfare and larger-than-life scale without needing to grasp every detail of the lore underpinning it. This means between each battle, if you want to pay attention and get sucked in further, you can, but you don't have to be a part of this universe's reality. After all, in the far future, there is only war. It creates an initial point of engagement for the player and slowly builds investment in a way that allows unfamiliar players to enjoy playing the game while absorbing the world through context. And in practice, it puts you in the armor of certified absolute unit Demetrian Titus. A man, if he can still be called that, whose purpose in life is, in his own words,
My craft is death.
as Titus, the enormous scale and impact of events that occur around you and the behavior of the soldiers fighting in this greater conflict make you feel like your objectives and concerns are at a level far beyond what they can even fathom. Here you are, walking around looking down on the ranks of Imperial Guard while they not only acknowledge your presence, but kneel in reverence before you as you approach. Even their basic reactions make it abundantly clear that they're just trying like hell to survive each encounter with the enemy, while to you these encounters are nothing but checkpoints along your journey to fulfill the much larger role you are here to play in it. A role that, as you play, becomes more and more essential as each layer of this conflict is peeled back to reveal increasingly more dramatic consequences should you fail. With each moment you engage with the combat, your knowledge of the world is built upon, not just thematically, but mechanically. The smoothness of the parry kills show you that despite the size and strength of these characters, they are still absurdly fast and agile. The executions and the ease with which these Space Marines just absolutely tear their enemies apart prove that they were never really in danger, although that soon changes as the story unfolds. Where Helldivers 2 built its world around the idea that every Helldiver is disposable and could introduce a new Helldiver at a moment's notice to fill the boots of any other that died in battle, within the world of Warhammer, the Space Marines are the opposite. They are each a unique specimen, only totaling about 1 million across the entire galaxy, and they're seen rarely enough by the average soldier that they've taken on an almost mythical status. In development, this meant that Saber Interactive would have to expertly straddle that line between making you feel like an absolute monster while still creating an element of real danger. And I think they've done it. Not just by making you hit hard, which you do, or by throwing hordes of enemies at you, which they do, but by implementing what's called a rally system. And I think this is one of the best UX elements of this game. In brief, a rally system in games is when the player character's health bar gives the user a bit of a buffer zone to try earn lost health back through aggressive play after they take damage. It's a system that was famously used in Bloodborne to counterbalance the enormous utility of blocking in FromSoft's earlier games like Dark Souls, because the developers saw that it encouraged too much passivity. Some games have the buffer zone get smaller over time, while others keep the buffer zone present but only allow damage under a certain threshold to be healed, which means some of the incoming damage will always be permanent. Space Marine 2 implements both by applying different rules to the armor and health system. Armor damage is permanent and can only be healed by executions or what are called gun strikes that result in kills, while health is on a timer and is more what users typically expect from a rally system. That being said, going back to my original point of start simple, build slowly, the core purpose of this mechanic is to keep players aggressive, tactical, and most importantly, immersed in this world, allowing the combat dynamics to reflect the lore-accurate behavior of the Space Marine, while still allowing the user to feel a sense of danger. And it's incredibly clever, serving as a counterbalance for a natural inclination towards loss aversion. On top of this, the normal foundational ebb and flow of combat is excellent. Weapons feel great in both their sound design and feedback, and you become very aware of when you need to lock in or when you can just relax a little. You can also very naturally determine when it's a good time to fully commit to thinning the enemy's ranks as quickly as possible so you don't get killed, or methodically time your stuns, kills, and executions to minimize the ammo you expend while maximizing the amount of health and armor you retain. Even more than that, in the co-op campaign adjacent to the main story, all of this is dialed up to 11. A variety of classes and class-based weaponry that are absent in the main campaign, likely due to story and character considerations, play a big part here. While it would have been very easy to relegate these classes to an afterthought, Saber Interactive didn't, and they are all incredibly well balanced, offering very clear and unique advantages, disadvantages, and playstyles for each class and their respective loadouts. However, while combat is really that good and very finely tuned, lending itself incredibly well to the sense of immersion, it's not perfect. Weapon switching, for some reason, has been assigned to down on the D-pad, which breaks with established mental models of using the triangle or Y button to switch weapons if there are only two available. This isn't uncommon, but that's a choice made mainly for games that have more than two weapons and allow the user to hotkey those weapons to the D-pad themselves. This, in the grand scheme of things, aggressively restricts the user's ability to smoothly switch between their primary and secondary weapon while on the move or running out of ammo. The secondary weapon in this case also happens to be paired with their melee weapon, meaning it's hard to get into a flow state where the user really feels in control and can seamlessly switch between ranged, backup, and melee combat. Looking at the design of the game, this was likely a decision made to encourage the use of class abilities, but that could very easily have been bound to a combination of L1 and R1 or the right and left bumpers, which would be more intuitive, as these are the buttons that get the most traffic. Sure, some accidental triggering would occur in the early stages, but once players get more comfortable and intentional with their block and attack functions, it would become second nature. Grenades, in this case, are also tied to the X or A button, meaning looking around and fine-tuning how you use grenades is less flexible unless you play with what's called a claw grip. And worst of all, there are no custom bindings for controls, so you can't change these unless you make use of the fixed presets in the game, none of which solve this problem. This wouldn't be much of an issue if both power and agility weren't a trademark of a Space Marine, but they are, and unfortunately as it stands, these controls create a lot of dissonance between the role the user tries to fill and what they're physically allowed to do with a controller. Another issue I have is that there are very few cues to indicate damage taken, or that the player is in danger. I can't count how often I got downed out of nowhere because of little visual or auditory information being fed to the user as a heads up that they're nearing death, except for the health bar and a slight vignette. I even tried testing this by removing the HUD entirely and simply could not tell when I was about to die. Additionally, with some of the feedback systems for the melee weapon heavy and light attacks when trying to stun enemies, the system can be very inconsistent and impacts only one enemy at a time. Imagine if instead, once you stunned a group of smaller enemies, you could gunstrike them one after the other immediately, switching targets after each kill just because you timed a heavy attack correctly. While it might be a little overpowered, it'd also be a powered trip, and would definitely let the user know what a Space Marine is about, while still requiring some mastery. And I think that's worth it to create a strong sense of immersion. Even just intensifying post-processing effects when taking heavy damage can raise the stakes in mounting a comeback despite barely being able to see or hear anything, and that would at least do a much better job in making it clear that you survived by the skin of your teeth. All of this leads me to my second point: faithfulness to the universe. To drive the connection between identity and adoption, sometimes, instead of giving the player answers by forcing exposition on them or juicing them up, you need to hold back and ask some questions instead. Maintain your faithfulness to the world, but give the casual player openings to get stuck in. Do you understand what the studs on Titus's head mean?
You see those service studs?
What's with the paper stuck to their armor? Why does Chadriel have a red helmet while the others are blue? With questions like this, the game starts cracking doors open and beckoning you through the decades-long history of Warhammer as an IP, and these characters' identities really play a big part in the game's core experience.
Our lieutenant is over 200 years old. He couldn't have been born in Primaris.
This kind of approach allows the developers to present a world full of factions, technologies, internal politics, and larger-than-life heroes with little exposition to guide new players. And that can be challenging for newcomers, but it's natural. And because it's natural, it feels right to not know, but want to learn about it. And when the game's visual storytelling and environmental cues are as detailed and remarkable as they are in Space Marine 2, these things in tandem do an excellent job in filling in the gaps to assist the user in their education.
I'm fine. It must be the Rubicon surgery.
This is what I mean by blending this idea of history with accessibility, the old with the new. For dedicated Warhammer fans, this faithfulness is a major strength, and the game refuses to compromise on its established identity, creating a sense of authenticity and respect for the source material. It appeals deeply to a dedicated niche while still remaining accessible through its gameplay. Which leads me to my final point: the characters. Titus, Gadriel, and Karen are battle brothers, and on the surface, while they might to those unfamiliar give off an air of stereotypical military dude bro zealot energy, in actuality they each bring distinct personalities to the table. Gadriel is loyal and believes in traditions and codes. As a result, he is disciplined and has a strong sense of honor, respect, and trust, not given, but earned, and this causes conflict within the team. Karen, on the other hand, is analytical, serving as more of a tactician, prioritizing adaptability over tradition, and to the user, presents as an advocate for careful analysis, problem solving, and practicality. The third member of our cohort, however, Titus, embodies the very archetype of a heroic, experienced leader. A character that is calm under pressure, stoic, and driven by a sense of honor and duty to protect humanity. He's as close to a perfect hero as we're gonna get.
I would die for these colors.
While he does in a lot of ways embody the best and worst of both of his brothers by being pragmatic and willing to bend the rigid rules of the Codex when necessary, his character flaws are in the grand scheme of things still upsides to the rest of the Imperium, seeing him often resign himself to fate or the will of the Emperor. And with that, we're really getting to the meat of this chapter: how our heroes affect our experience and how we play games. Archetypal figures of their own, heroes have been a huge topic in the zeitgeist due to the rise of streaming platforms like Netflix, social media, and of course the staggering success of media companies like Disney and their MCU IP, which means that the number of people exposed to hero-related subject matter has been growing exponentially. Because of this, we've seen heroes become much more complex characters, evolving across cultures and narratives, leaving the door open for the likes of Deadpool, Kratos, and Batman. Gone are the days of Achilles, Hercules, Beowulf, and Gilgamesh. Or are they? Over the past decade, we've seen a notable focus on deconstructed and morally ambiguous heroes. All you have to do is look as far as your TV remote to find shows like Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad, and The Boys that challenge the black and white morality of traditional hero narratives, which, in a wider sense, reflect a cultural shift towards valuing nuance and realism. This is because audiences have become more interested in flawed characters that reflect their own worldviews. They are relatable, and they too struggle with moral dilemmas, which, if you watched my video on Hunt Showdown, might recognize as a main element of self-determination theory. Enter the anti-hero. Characters that range from smugglers and Old West cowboys to political heroes and humanitarians, suggesting that heroes from all walks of life like Arthur Morgan or Joel Miller can often exist in the gray areas between right and wrong, laying the groundwork for more authentic and multifaceted storytelling. A paper written by Sander Kool and a few colleagues from VU Amsterdam, titled The Birth and Death of the Superhero Film, also provides more insight into this deconstructionist idea, so if you're interested, I encourage everyone to give that a read. But back to our main point. In the past decade, we've also seen economic instability, political polarization, pandemics like COVID-19 and climate change, which have heightened anxiety and uncertainty. And as we have always done in times of crisis, we turn to heroes as symbols of hope and resilience, representations of ideals that audiences can rally around. And that's the key here, this concept of ideals. Stories of heroes, in a wide sense, offer a sense of structure, meaning, and moral clarity in chaotic circumstances. They are exemplary of the quote-unquote right thing to do in a given circumstance. And during times of uncertainty and stress, these characters, with their ideals, provide a sense of order and justice. And it's because of this that we've slowly but steadily begun to spur nuance and morally ambiguous heroes. In times of uncertainty, we do not seek further uncertainty. We do not pursue or desire ambiguous ideals. We need clear direction. There are many studies about this, including those conducted by folks like Elaine Kinsella, Zeno, Franco, and George Goethals, which are all linked below. But the long and short of it is that we are not made to jump from the frying pan into the fire. We seek safety, and concerningly, it exemplifies why we've been steadily drifting once again towards idealistic, extreme, and black and white perspectives on what is right and what is wrong, and it can be traced right to the popularity of games like Helldivers 2 and Space Marine 2, and what makes them so compelling. After all, as Jack Kirby once wrote, there came a time when the old gods died. The brave died with the cunning, and the noble perished, locked in a battle with unleashed evil, for it was the last day for them. The Holocaust, which destroyed the old gods, split their ancient world asunder and created in its place homes for the new forces to rise and grow and achieve powers to move the universe in new ways. So, to set the tone here, I recently had my birthday, and as I grow older, I found myself thinking about legacy a lot more. When I eventually die, what do I want to leave behind? How do I build a legacy that can stand the test of time? And even in advance of that, how do I carry the legacy of my family before me forward in a way that would make them proud while reconciling it with the one I want to build for myself? So far, I don't have any clear-cut answers yet, but one theme that always occurs to me when I get into the weeds of this idea is that whatever legacy I build needs to be adaptable. It needs to both idealistically and practically be able to flow and maybe even bend with the inevitability of change, but not break. So why am I going on about legacy? This is, in the end, just a video about a game. How does legacy even tie into user experience as a whole? Well, it's not as far-fetched as you might think. One recurring theme I've been hearing a lot in discourse about Space Marine 2 is that it's a very video game-ass video game. That it's a complete package that's been finely tuned and refuses to compromise on what it wants to deliver. I also hear that it harkens back to the old Xbox era, bolstered by legacy mechanics that range from health and armor pickups to the lack of cover-based shooting. And I want to let that one sit with you for a bit. That old Xbox era. Anyone who's had their finger on the pulse of the industry for the past year will likely feel that there's a lot of change on the way. Not only are the old Xbox days long gone, but the Xbox itself, for all intents and purposes, has been relegated to palliative care, or at least placed on life support if it's not considered outright dead by now. However, through the success of Space Marine 2, we see that while the platform itself, or this old way of making games, may be considered dated, the legacy that they left behind clearly still lives on in proverbial books that are worth taking a page or two out of moving forward. The characters of Space Marine 2 themselves are too representative of this idea.
Learning from the past, something AAA game developers in large part have failed to do.
Titus, in his reluctance to consider what he could have done differently in his past, breeds distrust and almost irreparably damages his brotherhood. He's only able to find redemption and take on a true leadership role after he changes his ways. Gadriel then reflects a changed Leandros, and as a result of this growth, they're all left better off because of it.
The Codex Astartes does not support this action. But I am looking forward to it.
This, I think, is what legacy is about. Acknowledging that we don't have to abandon our convictions or our history, but that we do have to recognize that leaving behind something that can stand the test of time means adapting to changed circumstances. And in that vein, Saber, in their seemingly infinite wisdom, made the decision to not treat Space Marine 2 as if it was made in a vacuum or isolated from the underlying IP like so many other licensed video games do. Instead, they've capitalized on it by honoring the legacy of those that came before, guiding us into the wider world of Warhammer, and in doing so have caused an impact on the entirety of the IP that has, dare I say, completely altered its trajectory in a way that it's never seen before. Space Marine 2 hitting record sales numbers for a Warhammer game is just where it starts. It's brought the IP a massive audience from a market that Warhammer has somewhat struggled to find its footing in. And more impressively, it's had such an enormous ripple effect across the IP's entire video game catalog that it's given all other Warhammer video games an enormous boost in their own sales figures. In a lot of ways, the Warhammer audience is the apex of a hardcore demographic. This single IP exists across an enormous range of hobbies: gaming, reading, tabletop, fucking painting. It covers such a wide spectrum that I've heard getting into Warhammer described as going back to college to triple major in fine arts, Napoleonic warfare, and space opera biblical studies by one individual.
And somehow, this game has gotten the average gamer to take it all on, simply by making use of good user experience design.
Space Marine 2, for Warhammer as a whole, has proven it's more than a footnote in the annals of its history. It's demonstrated that it's the first chapter in a brand new testament, where the legacy of heroes is the memory of a great name and the inheritance of a great example. So that's it. That's the Space Marine 2 experience. It is an entertaining game to play, and it does a fantastic job leveraging our nostalgia for eras gone by to appeal to the stability-seeking sensibilities of humans. But I also believe what makes it truly compelling is that it offers a lot of depth and plenty to think about, from how you respect an IP's history, to the power of heroes and guiding presences, to the idea of building a legacy that honors those that were, those that are, and those that have yet to come. But that's it from me. If this video taught you a little more about what makes your favorite game so compelling, drop a like, and if you have any thoughts, leave a comment below so we can have a chat about this game. I think it's very easy to jump to the conclusion that it's just mindless entertainment, but there's so much bubbling under the surface of this game's success, and I think we're just now starting to see glimpses of what Warhammer could become. So with that said, I will see you guys again very soon, and until then, take care.